Okay. I wanted to talk to you about dogs.
Dogs.
Now, I did see a picture of Sandy.
Yeah.
I think I have a couple of pictures where Sandy's in it.
Yeah, and that fixed picture that you did was definitely Sandy.
And what kind of dog was Sandy?
A collie, but he was a small collie.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's a name for that particularly, but he was a collie. And I don't know where he came from. We just always had Sandy. From the earliest I can remember, a dog, it was Sandy.
And when did Sandy pass? Or not come home again?
Not come home. Okay, the first I remember of Sandy is when we lived at I guess you'd call it the Spring Hill Farm. I know we had Sandy then.
Mm-hmm.
Then we moved to the Paola Farm. Then we moved to Gardner.
Which move did Sandy end up going back to the old farm?
Sandy went from the Gardner Farm back to the Paola Farm, the farthest distance. And
So you had moved in for how long?
not too long, but
And then the dog went missing.
yeah, the dog went missing. We moved from Paola to Gardner, and Sandy went missing. I don't know if we had another dog at the time. We usually had what we called a rat terrier,
Mm-hmm.
a small dog of unknown breed that accompanied Sandy. But Sandy went missing. And I was kind of surprised or disappointed or something that Dad didn't seem to be particularly upset that Sandy was missing. Maybe he didn't want to upset me. But anyway, at some time, a few days after that, he went back to the Paola Farm and got Sandy. Because Sandy had just gone home from the new farm to the old farm. And I one time tried to figure out how far that was. It probably was 15 miles, something like that. And so we brought Sandy back, and I don't think we ever tied Sandy up. Sandy stayed the second time.
Grandpa had stories about dogs. And there was a pair of dogs, a collie and a terrier. But I don't remember him ever telling me what the names of those dogs were. He talked about a collie that when it was young got kicked in the face by a cow. And so from then on, it would approach an animal from the front, which made it useless for hurting anything.
Mm-hmm.
Was that Sandy?
I don't know. I'm not aware of that, or of a dog getting kicked in the face. But I don't know when Dad first got Sandy.
Mm-hmm.
I may have been a baby, or maybe I wasn't born. I don't know how long he'd had Sandy. But no, I'm not aware of that. We usually had two dogs, and the second one, the small dog, was either a hand-me-down or a stray. We'd get a dog would show up, and just let it stay around. If nobody claimed it, it just stayed.
Well, Grandpa had the story about this terrier. Well, he said, okay, this is what Grandpa, and I know he said that I'm not, that Aunt Ursula, that we called Aunt Ursula, bought you a terrier. And I guess you going to school, the dog followed Grandpa around when he was out working in the fields. And one time, coming back from the fields in his tractor, the terrier stopped to scratch his ear or whatever, and Grandpa ran it over and killed
All right, I can update that.
him. Okay.
We had a terrier, a small dog,
Mhm.
on the Paola farm. And Mom and Dad and I were driving home. We turned in the driveway. Often the dogs, or at least this terrier, one dog or both dogs, would hear the car coming on the road and would run out to the road to meet us. So we were driving in the gravel driveway, and the terrier was there, trotting ahead of the car, and all of a sudden stopped to scratch his ear and thump. And the terrier jumped up and ran up onto the front porch, which is where they kind of a home place for the dogs. They didn't sleep there necessarily. Well, they probably did in good weather. Ran up onto the porch and lay down and died. And it was a sad day. But I think that my story is the better one because it's really in my memory.
Okay.
And yeah, I can almost picture it.
Well, maybe that was the same story. Well, I know it's the same story, but maybe Grandpa left out enough when he was telling me
Maybe.
that I have just filled in the blanks with him coming back. I just imagined okay, what if he said you were coming back to the house and the dog stopped in front of you and you ran it over? Okay, so he left out the fact that you and Grandma were with him. He left out the fact that he was in a car. And so in my mind, I didn't put you or Grandma in there in the story. And I just assumed tractor.
Yeah, well, could be.
So, all right. But this part I'm pretty sure about. He said that he then went to a local pet store and bought a replacement.
I don't know about that.
Okay. And so
You said Ursula bought
the original.
Give me the original terrier. Okay, I don't remember that either. But I just know over time we had 1, 2, 3, possibly 4 little dogs that I remember doing things. Another one getting killed.
Yeah. So, so his stories seem to be about this replacement terrier and a collie that he had at the same time. So the collie that you had when the one dog got run over, was that Sandy?
Must have been, yeah.
Okay. He told a story about killing rats.
Oh,
like
okay.
that got underneath a building,
I know. What,
and then he hooked up the exhaust
mhm.
to a hose, and uh, two dogs and a boy with a wagon spoke uh, surrounded the building in question. I assumed it was a grain bin, but I don't know.
Mhm.
And he'd start up the car and then blow the carbon dioxide down into the rat tunnels, and the rats would come scurrying out, and the dogs and the boy would kill the rats as they were coming out. And I heard from at least one source that the dogs were a lot more effective than the boy with the wagon spoke.
Oh, I'm sure. Yes. Okay, yes, we had a grain storage,
Mm,
and that's probably why all rats were there, because probably there was corn in there, would fall through the cracks into the underneath or something. Anyway, he pumped the exhaust in there. The rats would come out, and as I remember, the door was up a ways, not right down on the floor. So the rats would come out and jump.
okay, I thought, okay, I've got another story about that, but they didn't come out from underneath the grain bin?
Yeah. I don't know whether that's a separate story, or I do know that they may have come out from underneath too. I do know that rats, they jumped because the terrier could catch them.
Okay, now that, Grandpa said, or told me another story about, and he didn't include a boy with a wagon spoke, but maybe he was present as well. But it would be at night, Grandpa would pull up and turn on, keep the headlights on, pointing at the door to the grain bin.
Okay.
And the collie would sit between the headlights facing the door, and Grandpa would put the terrier in the grain bin.
Hmm.
And the terrier would start killing the rats, and the rats, trying to get away from the terrier, would jump up on the door, and because they were blinded by the car lights, they would jump towards the collie, not knowing it was there, and the collie would just snap at them
Mhm.
and kill them in midair, kind of thing.
Okay.
Does that
Yeah,
sound
I would say it's just as good a story as mine. So.
okay? But do you think that was Sandy as well?
Oh yeah. Mhm.
Okay.
Mhm. It would have been Sandy.
Now, all right, so it's nice to have a name for one of the dogs. Do you remember what the name was? Because even Grandpa didn't tell me the name of the dog.
No, I don't remember any of the little dog names at this time. So
Oh, well.
one other little dog that we had was a stray that came into Grandpa Clinkscale's homestead.
Mm-hmm.
And since that highway, there was a highway right there,
Mm-hmm.
quarter mile or so. Somebody probably, there were a number of houses around there. Somebody probably dumped it out. And it just happened to pick the best house there, with Grandpa and Grandma's house. But I guess either we needed a little dog or they didn't. They didn't have little dogs. They had a larger dog. And so they probably gave it to us. I know that's how we got one of our dogs. And maybe the last little one that we had. I don't know. So, yeah.
Good.
So, but I sat down on the doorstep, and the collie liked to be petted,
Mm-hmm.
and petted and petted and petted, and Collie was just happy to be there. And I decided one time, I'm going to pet that dog till it quits wanting to be petted. Sure, I did. I don't know how long it was, probably 15 minutes, but anyway, I petted it forever. And it was perfectly happy to stand there and let me pet it. So,
Well, there was, it seemed like a number of pets got left out, let loose by the Clinkscale place.
could be with the highway and with all the half dozen other houses around there.
Mm-hmm.
People would feel like, well, somebody will adopt it, or he'll find food there somewhere. And so, yes, that's probably true. Oh, one other story about Sandy and a little dog
Mm-hmm.
is that Cal Hunter was a farmer and lived about 2.5 miles away. And he had hounds. And he had a pack of hounds, like 6, 8, something. And you could hear them coming up the road.
Mm-hmm.
Whether they were chasing rabbits or anything, they just made a noise. And so one day those hounds came up our road, and being on the railroad was kind of filled right there, so it was above the level of the ground.
Was this the one where you had the
underpass.
underpass? Okay, and I'm sorry, that was Paola?
Paola.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, the road went across in front of the yard, which was a fairly good-sized yard, and then raised up over the railroad crossing, and then went back down on the far side and went on across the field, across the area which was fields. And so the hounds were coming, and Sandy and the small dog were on the front porch where they usually just lay.
Mm-hmm.
And here came these hounds, and they yapped across, and they went on down over the railroad. I may be making this up, I don't know. Our dogs just lay there on the porch. And here came a stray hound that was lagging behind, trotting along. And they took after the stray. They didn't get mixed up with the pack of hounds, but this one stray hound, they went after him. And they chased it, and it went up over the railroad, and the whole pack came back over the railroad. And my dogs, one of them went through the screen door. They came across the yard and jumped on the porch, and it just slid right into the screen and broke the screen.
I had heard that story as well.
Okay.
I didn't have quite the specifics. It could have been a pack of 40
Oh,
dogs.
They would often sound like there were 40 of them, but no, it wasn't quite that many.
Okay, well, okay. Once again, Grandpa may have told me the same story, and my mind made up some details that he didn't fill in.
Well, I'm doing that too, so.
Because I imagined, and I thought it was more than 8.
It was what?
I thought it was more than 8.
Oh,
But he didn't, Grandpa didn't specify. And Grandpa, I thought he said that there were 2 of the hounds were on the close side of the railroad embankment, and your 2 dogs tore after them and chased them over, and then a little while later 2 dogs came running back with the whole pack in pursuit, and that the collie went through the screen door.
okay. Well, same story.
Yeah.
Sounds fine to me. Yeah. I don't remember any other dog stories particularly.
You mentioned something about the screw worms or
Oh,
something.
yeah. Well, at that time, we did not have insecticides for and I might have my terminologies, the bot flies. And the bot flies would lay eggs in wounds,
I think that's a screw fly.
screw fly. Okay, screw fly that would lay eggs in wounds.
Mm-hmm.
And then they would feed on the dead flesh. And the more they fed on it, the more dead flesh there was, and they multiplied. And they would kill a dog or a calf or something, very large animal. And so Sandy maybe lost a tooth or something. Anyway, had a wound in his mouth. And Dad discovered that he had screwworms in there. And the only cure that we had, other than just plain kerosene, which he used all the time for stuff, was to get all the screwworms out of the wound. If it had been a calf, he would have done the same thing. And so he got Sandy and had Sandy lay down. It seems like they hadn't been on its side. And I was there to hold Sandy and calm it, pet it. And Sandy lay there quietly while Dad dug around in his mouth and picked those screwworms out one at a time until he was sure he had gotten the cavity emptied. And then he poured a little kerosene in it probably, and
That must have started.
turned Sandy loose, and he was fine.
So the bot flies lay the egg on, they like inject the eggs or whatever. And so there will be a sore, it'll be a swelling, and then the flies will come out of that.
No, I don't think the flies came out of that. I think
The worms did.
an early generation of a fly or a butterfly or whatever would form in this capsule-like thing inside, under the skin. And on cattle, they couldn't get them off of their backs. Horses could help some because they could roll over, and they would do that now and then. But cattle couldn't get them off of their backs. And so,
Are these like the black flies that you mentioned that would just cover them?
yeah. And so they would have all these flies drilling a hole through the leather, through their skin, which is leather, and then laying eggs in there. And they would form there was a term for it, a capsule-like formation in the leather. And eventually the worm would come out, it goes to the ground, goes through its process, and comes out as another fly. And,
Reason I know anything about bot flies is turtles can get bot flies. So when you started talking about flies, when you first started talking about screwworms, I was thinking, is that the same as a bot fly? And so I looked it up, and no, they're different.
I don't know what the screwworm flies looked like, whether they were bothersome or not. The bot flies were bothersome. They'd drive cattle mad. They would run, hoping to get rid of them, which it didn't work. And at that time, you took some kind of chemical, soaked a burlap bag in it, wrapped it around a wire, hung it, and the cattle would learn to go under there and apply this to their backs. And when they went under it, it would brush down their back. it would not only knock the flies off, but it would apply creosote or
something that would
some
discourage.
pagan insecticide that we had.
There is some I bought some of this recently, and you can treat your clothing, and it's an insecticide, and you treat your clothing, and it'll stay on your clothing even when you wash it. It'll stay a number of times. And the bugs that crawl on it, the ticks and mosquitoes, they'll bite you, but then they'll die.
Oh, good.
Uh,
I don't know.
So, I wonder if that's what they put on, something like that, they put on the cows' backs or something like that.
We probably had something that was pretty much waterproof. Otherwise, first rain, it would all wash off.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah, I think that some of the treatments, maybe even DDT in a formulation that would be sticky. DDT, you're familiar with it?
Yeah.
And so, I don't know. It seems logical that they would. But screwworm flies. I was acquainted with a guy that worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, whose project that he worked on full-time was eliminating screwworms in the United States because they came from Mexico.
Yeah.
And he was successful. He was able to go into Mexico and create a barrier area strip across Mexico where they killed all of the screwworm flies so that there were no longer a supply coming into Texas.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, as a child, I remember seeing films in school about them trying to eliminate the screw fly in southern United States, and they talked about these sterile males that they would release that would mate with the females, and they would lay eggs which didn't hatch.
Mm-hmm.
And how this, but if you had them coming in from Mexico every year,
Mm-hmm.
you'd have to keep doing that. So they did it in the United States, but they also did it in Mexico,
Mm-hmm.
and that gave you that barrier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this guy, that was his job at the time. Mm-hmm.
Well,